Hi, welcome back to the channel. In this, the second part of our series of videos on starting bushcraft, we're going to look at shelter. The reasons that we need shelter and what a shelter needs to cover to be effective. We're going to look at what shelter options we are actually carrying with us in our little kit. And we're also going to look at how to construct a natural shelter using what nature provides. So for us to have adequate and effective shelter, we actually have to understand what we are sheltering from. Well, essentially, it's the elements. So we've got sunshine, we've got rain or snow, we've got wind, and then finally we've got the cold. And those are the four things that we need to look at. And if our shelter is going to be effective, it's got to protect us from each of those four things. So as I said, for our shelter to be effective, it's got to protect us from those four things. Sunshine, well, sunshine, we're in the woodlands, we've got shade. So sunshine isn't too much of a problem. Rain or snow, well, whatever our shelter option is, it needs to be waterproof or capable of shedding water easily. Wind, as far as wind goes, our shelter needs to be windproof, and we need to think about wind direction if we're building a shelter, and also having a layer of windproof clothing with us to protect us from the wind. The combined effects of wind and rain can be quite deadly, especially if we add to that cold. Talking of cold, whatever our shelter is, it needs to protect us from the cold, and that needs quite careful consideration. Obviously, our first line of defence against the elements is the actual clothing that we're wearing. Also, in our little training bag, there are items that will help give us protection from the weather. We've got a warm kit in the form of a woolly hat, a fleece, possibly a poncho liner, and we've also got our actual poncho. Our poncho will not only provide protection from the rain, but it will also provide us with protection from the wind as well. So it's a really useful piece of kit. If you're in an open area when you've got lots and lots of sunshine, it can also be strung up to give us adequate shade. So we are carrying sensible shelter options with us. One of the things we need to think about when using the items from our training kit is that we use them effectively. Remember, to get adequate protection, we need to protect ourselves from all of the elements. Our poncho, if it's really raining, will protect us from both the wind and the rain. A warm kit will protect us from the cold, so we are covered. When we stop, and we stop for a rest, or perhaps you're stopping for lunch, our poncho will still give us protection from wind and rain. But one thing that people seem to forget is we also need protection from the cold. And what I see people do quite often is sit onto the floor, put their waterproofs on, sit down, have a cup of tea or a snack, and have a little rest. What they're not doing is, although they've protected themselves from wind and rain, they haven't protected themselves adequately from the cold, because by sitting directly on the ground, they're losing body heat through conductivity. Their heat is literally leaching out of anything that is in contact with the ground. So what I always try and do is put a barrier between me and the cold ground, so my body heat is not being conducted away from me. The easiest thing that I carry that I can do this with is my day sack. I just put my day sack on the ground and I sit myself on there. I can wrap myself up in my poncho so that I'm protected from the wind and the rain. I'm more comfortable and I'm not losing body heat. Obviously, if I'm going out into the woods training, I've got my little day sack, and in there I've got my poncho. What that allows me to do is I can put up some sort of temporary shelter that will give me protection from the elements for the day. Now there's lots of different ways of stringing them up. If you go over to my how to rig a tarp video, it will show you lots of different options. In this video, I'm just going to show you the simple plough point shelter, and it's a nice easy one because it only relies on one tying off point, and that could be a tree, it could be a slab of rock, it could be anything, but you only need that one point. All the others are just straightforward pegged out to the ground, and it will give you protection from 3 directions because you get protection from the rear, protection from either side as well. So that's shelter using the gear that we're carrying. Now we're going to look at natural shelters, how we can use what nature provides to put a shelter together which will protect us from wet, wind and cold. Now, I see a lot of shelters on social media and indeed on YouTube, and they look really great. Open fronted with a big fire in front of them, a raised bed with neatly sawn logs and everything's cut to exact sizes. If that's what you're looking for, then probably the rest of this video isn't for you. If you are looking for a shelter that is easy to build, requires no tools or cordage, requires a minimum of materials, is thermally efficient, then that's what I'm about to cover. Over the years I've spent a lot of time in natural shelters and I know what works for me. I have a few rules when I'm thinking about putting a shelter together. Number 1, keep it simple. So I keep the design as simple as possible. Keep it small. I want a small shelter. I don't want a massive great big shelter because it's going to use up lots of materials and in turn that's going to use up a lot of energy putting it together. So I keep it simple, I keep it small. I also keep the roof angle steep. A lot of people look at my shelters and you can see they think, well, there's not a lot of space in there. No, there isn't. And the roof angle is steep for a very good reason. Steep roof angles shed water much better. The shallow ones allow the water to come in. Back when I was doing some work for Footsteps of Discovery down in Cornwall, the way they got their students to remember it was with something called the shelter prayer, and it was ever so easy. They got everyone to put their hands together like that, and if it was at that angle, dry, damp, wet, soaking. The steeper the angle, the easier the water runs off it. So keep your shelter design simple, keep it small, keep the angle steep, and those are the basic rules. So the next thing we need to think about is the actual location we're going to build our shelter in. We've got a rough plan, but there's several things that we need. Now, I don't use cordage when I'm building my materials. Instead, I look for a tree with either a good Y-shaped fork in it or several branches sticking out the side so that I can put a long supporting pole resting onto that branch. And it needs to be a fairly good, sturdy branch for it to sit on. Apart from that, there's a few other things I need to look for. All the usual things that we look for when we're pitching a tent, in fact. So good even ground, so I'm not rolling downhill. Ground that is well drained, so that it's not going to flood if it suddenly rains. Ground that has no hazards on it, so I don't want tree roots, rocks sticking up, all of those sorts of things, because that could cause me a problem. I also need to look upwards as well, because there are hazards possibly above us. So if we look up at the tree and perhaps there's some big overhanging branches, check that they're healthy. Is the bark flaking off them? If it's summertime, why has that branch got no leaves on it? All of these things could mean that perhaps a branch could be dropped during the night, and the last thing you want is that branch dropping onto your shelter. The last thing we actually need is not only the right location, but we need the right location with materials. We need to make sure we've got the materials to build our shelter in the location that we need them. There's no point in having the perfect location then to have to walk all of the materials in. The next thing that we need to do is actually size our shelter, and to explain that I'm going to use this model. I've got my location with my tree with my side branches. I've got my supporting pole, and this one needs to be quite strong because that's going to have quite a lot of weight on it once we've completed the shelter, and the last thing we would want is for this to break and the shelter to collapse while you're in it. So I'm going to put this into location. Once I've done that, I'm then going to shuffle myself down into the shelter and get in as far as I can. With that done, I'm then going to take 3 little sticks and just mark my width at the shoulders and about an arm's span above my head. So with my main supporting pole up and the ground cleared and marked so it's the right size, the next job that I'm going to do, well, most people think it would be to start putting the wood on, but actually no, it's not. The next thing I'm going to do is start to pile leaves up underneath the main supporting pole to create something that I can sleep on. Now remember what I said, for a shelter to be truly effective it needs to protect us from wet, so it needs to have a good roof, from wind, so it needs to have good sides, but from cold you need good insulation from underneath. Now I see a lot of photographs where people have built natural shelters, they put loads of vegetation on the outside, which is good, but they put very little on the floor inside, and ideally you want a really good thick layer of vegetation to keep you up off the cold ground. Because remember what I said, if your body is in contact with the ground, it's conducting your body heat away. Now, a little trick for you. I use something called my mini Moors scarf, and it's a great big long parachute nylon bag. What I do with mine is I fill it up with as much leaf litter as I can. It's sized so it's the length of my body, and I put that into my shelter before I get the sticks on. That gives me a good insulating mattress that I can lay on. It makes life a whole lot more comfortable. With that done, my next job is to start gathering all those logs together to start putting the sides onto my shelter. Because I've got the tree at one end, I always try and lean the logs against the tree. So everything is using a bit of gravity and a little bit of weight to hold it all in place. If they're completely vertical, then they could tip either way. If they're leaning slightly, and they have the weight of the next one next to it, and so on all the way down the line, it helps to hold our shelter together. Once I've got all my poles on the outside and they're nice and tight and close together, and they need to be so that the leaf litter doesn't start dropping through, then what I can do is start gathering my leaves up. Now it takes quite a lot of time just gathering up by hand, but I can use my waterproof poncho to help me move the leaves, and that way I can move large amounts of leaves really quickly. What it also allows me to do is, as I've got the leaves and I'm getting to the higher parts of the shelter, I can move them all in one go and put it on over the top. Because what I need ideally is a good covering up to about an arm's depth all over the shelter. That way I'm getting weatherproofness and insulation at the same time. This shelter relies on my body heat inside to keep me warm. It doesn't rely on the fire. So if I make a doorway as small as possible, and then once I'm in the shelter I can close the doorway off using something like my day sack, and that will help to keep my body heat inside the shelter and keep me warm. Now my body generates about as much heat as a 60 watt light bulb, and a 60 watt light bulb in a small confined space is actually quite warm. I'm also carrying gear that can keep me warm. I've got my fleece jacket and I've got my poncho liner, which can be used as an emergency sleeping bag. So I've got a good mattress to keep me off the ground. I've got excellent weatherproofing and insulation above me, and a small space to keep warm. I've also got a waterproof layer that can go over the top of my poncho liner, and ultimately that over the top of me. All of these things combined allow me to get a relatively warm and comfortable night's sleep. I can still have a fire with this shelter, and I can sit in the little porchway under cover. I can also store dry firewood in that little area as well. There's no need for me to thatch it all the way up to the top. Effectively all I'm creating is a windbreak, and I normally only thatch them to about half height. So there you go, I'm about done, and probably just in time because the light is starting to fade. Now a shelter like this will take between 4 and 6 hours to build. So it's not an easy undertaking. It's a lot of hard work, but once it's done, and if you've done it this way, it will keep you warm and dry no matter what the weather. As I said, probably doesn't look as pretty as the ones on YouTube, on Facebook, Instagram, etc. with their nicely trimmed up beds, but this works. Hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, then remember, share it. Hit the like button, and if you haven't already, subscribe. Check out my Etsy shop, Bushcraft shop, to see what gear I've got up for sale. And as always, if you want to leave a comment below, then please do. I've been Neil, and until next time, when we look at warmth and how to stay warm, stay safe. Thanks for watching.